Hi, good morning. I'm very privileged to share the stage with such fine-looking young gentlemen. Thank you. So, thank you for that really good overview of PPP in the Philippines. It's a fairly exciting time for all of us. It's our privilege here to be invited and to discuss with you our international experience in PPP development in the education sector. So I'm Lynn, and I look after, for Ernst & Young, the infrastructure advisory practice in ASEAN. Darren is my colleague from Australia as well. We're very active in the infrastructure advisory sector, and I think Becca, my colleague partner from SGV, is here as well. Next slide, please. The time I want to spend this morning really is to follow on from what was discussed before in terms of the Philippines PPP and education agenda, which is fairly transformational. This morning, I'd like to focus on the infrastructure aspects of PPP. I think the later speakers will talk about the sort of the broader education in public sector. So, next slide. It's very difficult. Essentially, from an infrastructure perspective and in the involvement of private sector, is really involvement in private sector in the provision of education infrastructure facilities. So you really involve private sector in the design, construction, the financing, and also the long-term operation and maintenance of the facility, and also the wider infrastructure-related services, so facility management, landscaping, or a combination of both. And why do governments look at it? Increasingly, across the globe, you do see, and my co-speakers will comment on that as well, you're really looking at ensuring a greater affordability in terms of value for money in education. How do we leverage the expertise of private sector in building education facilities? And also, how do we demonstrate value for money in this sector in terms of delivering the education outcomes, and more importantly is actually ensuring that the educators focus on education as opposed to building maintenance and design. Right. I'll very quickly spend on this slide is there are a number of commonalities in where we work on PPP facilities across the world. You find that private sector invests and maintains the facility, and where you find the differences in our international experience is the involvement in private sector in terms of the extent of the infrastructure and also the extent of the provision of education services. In the countries with substantial education PPP programs, these tend to focus on the infrastructure facilities, with education primarily still provided by public sector. From a risk perspective and a involvement of private sector very quickly, you can see you have the fully public at the bottom where you keep pretty much public sector runs, operates, and responsible for education, to the other end, which is a privatized delivery, so really your private schools. And you can see how PPP fits in between in either the management model, the outsourcing model, or, as we're talking about today, the infrastructure PPP model. Very quickly, I'll repeat what was said before. So a private sector is normally selected through a competitive tender process. They invest in the school and pretty much manage it on output specifications over a long period of time. So as you said, the relationship doesn't stop at contract award. It continues for possibly over 20 years. The government retains the responsibility for delivering the education services, and the private partner basically works in partnership with the government in terms of managing the facility, and they receive an annual payment, which is an attractive element for private sector to get a long-term payment for government, but this payment is contingent on providing a level of service. So it's not a rental, it's not a lease, it's actually a service payment. I thought it would be useful to, Australia was mentioned as, in a way, the top example for education PPPs in terms of what they've rolled out. So really is to give you a sense of the types of education PPPs that can be achievable. So we've got primary and secondary schools, we've got specialist colleges. Next slide. We've got student housing done as PPPs. You've got university facilities done as PPPs. So you really look at the whole spectrum of range of education facilities being able to be undertaken as PPPs. Next slide, please. Now, maybe a little bit closer to home, because I keep getting told that you talk about Australia and Canada. How about something in Asia? You know, what's happening in Asia? So I was a transaction advisor for the private sector, not the public sector, for the ITE College West. This was the first education PPP in Asia. It's a pretty ambitious project. As you can see, it's... Oh, that's my computer. All right, I'll better quick then. You see, it's the first education PPP in Asia. It's won a lot of awards, which my international standard is right up there. Asia Pacific PPP Deal of the Year. It's an extremely substantial building in terms of its scale, but more importantly, it wasn't actually specified as a building per se. If you look at what we ran. The ITE is important because it's all students who don't go into university and want post-secondary education go into ITE, and they take about 25% of the students coming out of secondary school. So what ITE said was, in order not for it to be an attractive education facility, they combine all the campuses into three mega campuses across Singapore with a focus on some key vocations. So this school focused on engineering, hospitality, and tourism, and I think business and technology. So as you can see, it was designed in an output spec. There was no classroom definition. We ended up with learning hubs. So if you go to which I hope you will, there are no classrooms there. It's a very open space. It has function centers. It has a functioning restaurant. It has a functioning hotel, convention center, and extremely dynamic open spaces for learning. And you know, the intake is phenomenal. The kids come in and they're pretty inspired in terms of learning. It's got Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's got a running track. And the whole thing was not designed in terms of, can you give me 25 classroom? It was really, this is my education outcome. How do you design a facility to basically enhance it and achieve it? So the idea of putting a hotel on top of the academy was not specified. It was what the private sector came up with in terms of understanding the curriculum. This is a 27-year contract, the longest such contract in Singapore. It was done to a cost of about $200 million. Now, immediately, just as a simple measure, the building actually is saving 30% of energy consumption than an equivalent facility in Singapore. So there are also, apart from the education outcome benefits, the the cost-saving benefits as well. Right, so the objectives really you're trying to achieve is risk transfer, innovation, all the good stuff that was talked about, better asset utilization. And we're looking at what can be done in the Philippines. So what are the opportunities here from both public and private sector to collaborate? We think, based on the hard work that the government and PPP Center has put in place, there's a phenomenal base and building blocks to really embark on education PPPs. So you've got regulation in place that facilitates it. You've got the institutional support. And now, more importantly, you've also got precedents in the market to look at. So while it's a pilot education projects, you've got a lot of precedents to learn from. So we think there's a huge potential to develop education PPPs in Philippines. We talked very briefly about PSIP-1. Very successful, huge market interest. As you can see, the construction is about 2/3 or 3/4 complete, so dead on time. I know there are a few hiccups because of the geography, location, and challenges. And then we have PSIP-2, which is structured slightly differently. The first one was build, transfer, and a lease back over 10 years. This was a build and transfer. So this is also on the way. It started a year after PSIP-1. I think the senior high school program, which is where we see probably the next area for where PPPs could fit in, is really driven from the result of the government's transformational K-12 program, which has driven a need for many, many new classrooms. Possibly, we think maybe 1,000 or 2,000. I mean, we talked about 60,000 classrooms. And again, new education facilities and how the government uses existing education facilities will be key to be able to achieve the outcomes desired for the K-12, so K-10 to 12. And, you know, as we said, DepEd is looking at all sorts of options, but we do strongly believe, given its durability, that PPP can play a pretty key role in this, and this is where also private sector like yourselves comes in. Very important in all the areas of jurisdictions that PPP is done. PPP is a component of the broader education curriculum in terms of infrastructure. I think Darren will say as well, really it's only 10 to 20% of projects in terms of public education buildings are done as PPPs. The bulk is still within public domain. Yeah. So what we did on the senior high school support program was we evaluated the PPP value drivers to see whether can we actually sensibly do PPPs for senior high schools, given its huge demand for new facilities. And from the study we did working together with PPP, DepEd and ADB is we think that based on the measures that I think we will explore later, there's a really good potential to embark on a education infrastructure PPP program. Apart from the senior high schools, we think, again, based on our experience and also the growth market in education here, there's a huge potential in student housing. I think vocational colleges will be a massive opportunity, public universities. And also, as we talked about, is the school bundling. So the senior high school bundlings would be an immediate opportunity here. So really taking PPPs forward in the Philippines, you know, we've set the bar with PSIP 1 and 2, I think, which has generated significant market interest. Where we'd like to take it is really the much fuller PPPs, which are the build, own, operates, the design, build, the DBFOs and things like that, which really brings the engagement of private sector into the education sector in a lot more comprehensive manner from both the infrastructure and from the education provision of services as well. Oh, I forgot to put the end on my slides. So that was the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Yeah.